All right. Hi, everyone. I am now going to continue with our lecture on cultural evolution. We've got about 17 slides to go. So I'm hoping, let me hide these. Okay, great. So where did we leave off yesterday? All right, so we talked a little bit about how cultures have been changing due to these three factors, at least these three factors, but these are the factors that I will cover in today's lecture. So cultures have been changing through interconnectedness, individualism, and based on intelligence. So interconnectedness, so how connected we are to one another. So because it's so easy and cheap to go to different countries, we are becoming increasingly interconnected. We also talked about the popularity of different companies. So Starbucks, IKEA, Nike, Adidas, Apple, and so on and so forth. If you go anywhere in the world, people probably know these companies and what they stand for. Many of these companies have different cultural ideals, like Starbucks has different cultural ideals, IKEA, and so on and so forth. So we're sharing these cultural ideas, and these companies are becoming more well known. Also, pop culture, so Hollywood movies are very popular no matter where you go. So because we have increased interconnectedness, we have more of a global culture. So internet is one major catalyst in spreading cultural information across national borders. If you go to Reddit, Twitter, all these different social media sites, you can find information that you might not necessarily find on different news sites. For instance, during the current war in Gaza, a lot of people are taking up to Twitter and places like Reddit to share this information. So although this interconnectedness has led to a global culture, it hasn't led to a homogenous world culture. So even if we're sharing very similar ideas, we all like going to Starbucks and IKEA, we have seen increased tribalism or return to more traditional and distinct cultures. Ian, yesterday, I keep wanting to say Ian, but I know it's not how you say it. It's Ian, talked about Native American cultures wanting to maintain their cultural practices, their language, but there are also some negative consequences of that too. So tribalism can come with religious overtones or violence. So for instance, holy wars, the perceived threat to white Americans, given that they will no longer be the majority by 2050. But there are also some examples of harmonious cultural diversity. So there can be both cultural diversity and homogeneity at the same time. So we can think of it at different levels. So there's cultural homogeneity at the global level. So at the global level, we have certain um, things that we believe to be true in terms of beauty, in terms of what products we trust, what brands we like. But there are also motivations for cultural diversity and heterogeneity at the local level. So when we think about different cities, whether it be New York, Singapore, Sydney, Toronto, LA, those different cities are very culturally diverse. So increased interconnectivity can lead to cultural homogeneity or global culture, but also still maintain cultural diversity. So we talked about individualism and collectivism. So now I'll go over it. So individualistic cultures emphasize personal goals. So encouraging children to move out of their parents' home once they're in college, paying workers in a company based on merit or personal achievements, whereas collectivistic cultures emphasize the collective goals of the in-group, whatever the in-group could be. It could be women, it could be your racial or ethnic group, it could be your nationality, it could be your socioeconomic status. Some examples of collectivistic culture include having children sleep with their parents, arranging marriages, paying workers based on their length of service instead of merit, and extended families living together. So we talked about how cultures are becoming more individualistic. So in the US, people have become less civically active since the 1960s. We talked about people being more likely to entertain guests at home, vote, join the PTA, and socialize with their neighbors in the past more relative to today. We participate in formal groups less today than we used to in the past. And why do researchers argue that this is happening? So there are a few different reasons. So one, there's more pressure for time and money. So money and materialism tends to correlate with individualism, so they tend to co-occur. Levels of individualism in the US have been found to track with economy, rising during economic boom and going down during a recession. So currently, it seems people have been talking about a recession happening in the US, and it does seem like people tend to be a little bit more collectivistic now in response to this. The pressures for money and time compete with people's ability to do things such as being socially engaged, being involved in your community, having your civic duties, volunteering, spending time with your kids, getting to know your neighbors. Those are at the bottom of people's to-do lists if what they're trying to do is survive. Then we have point two, which is increased suburbanization. So people spend more time in their cars because, let me see if I can highlighter, pointer. Yeah, increased suburbanization. So because people normally don't walk to work, people have to drive to work or to school. People spend more time in their cars driving to and from work and more time at home because once they're home, people don't want to leave, right? I live very close to a Walmart. Like if I walk there, it'd probably take 10 to 15 minutes. But if I drive there, it takes between 10 and 15 minutes just because of the way that the streets are laid out. But all of this makes it so much less likely for me to actually go to Walmart or go and run any errands once I'm home, because once I'm home, I don't want to leave. I don't want to have to keep driving. I want to be able to spend some time with my family. So because of the suburbanization, driving to work, driving home, having to run errands, spending time with their kids, this makes less time to see friends and run into neighbors during the day. We're all in our cars. How are we going to know where we are? There's more electronic entertainment, which is great, right? We were talking about different TV shows that we watch. On the one hand, it's great. We can be entertained at any moment in time. And researchers argue that this is a major factor for the increase in individualization or individualistic attitudes. So people tend to isolate themselves and watch TV passively. Usually you can binge a TV show by yourself over a weekend. You don't really talk to people about the TV show. On average, people tend to be of higher socioeconomic status, so people have more money. So more Americans are wealthier than before, and Americans have become more educated, which predicts individualism as well. More secular. So people have become less involved in organized religion, and increasing secularization predicts individualism. And although COVID, overall, there's a decrease in rates of infectious diseases, although COVID happened, and also all the anti-vax mommies that are bringing back things like smallpox and ridiculous things. But overall, there's a decreased rate in infectious diseases. So higher historical rates of infectious disease predict more collectivism, so the drop in these rates over time has been associated with more individualism. So a few slides before this, we talked about how in places like Japan or China, people wear masks all the time because it's a collectivistic culture. People are engaging in this behavior as a cultural norm to respect others and to maintain the well-being of the group. But because infectious diseases aren't as prominent in the US, save for COVID, people tend to be more individualistic. All right. So there's increased individualism even outside of the US, for example, in the United Kingdom with Brexit, just a disaster, and in traditionally collectivistic cultures like China and Japan. So we talked about Japan having increased divorce rates, decreased family size, valuing of increased independence, and deciding how many children to have. I also went over this in class yesterday. Another way that researchers have found increased individualism is the pattern of individualistic word frequency in books found in the UK and in China. So again, the types of media we consume tend to propagate cultural beliefs. So if there are more individualistic themes and words in books, then that reflects a more individualistic culture. All right, so let's keep going. All right, the third factor is intelligence. So the current generation has higher IQ scores than earlier generations, and this is known as the Flynn effect. And this is true on average across all cultures that have been studied so far. So intelligence quotient scores or IQ scores are thought to measure intelligence. So how much has IQ increased across generations? There's an average increase of 5 to 25 points per generation, although it might have sort of tapered down. It might not be more evident in the most recent generation. So to give you a rough sense of how much IQ scores have increased based on the rate of IQ increase in the past generation, someone scoring at the cutoff for mental retardation, which is the term that is used in some IQ scoring, now on a standardized test would have to score at the cutoff for gifted just a century ago, so 100 years ago. So what do researchers or people in general think about these increases in IQ? Does it really mean that people are more intelligent? So there's controversy surrounding what IQ tests really measure. Does it measure cultural competency of certain groups? Does it measure working memory? What does it really measure? And can we say that it measures a person's intelligence? So it's difficult to understand what being intelligent means, since what is considered intelligent depends on cultural context, right? In a culture where you are a hunter or a gatherer, no one cares how well you can solve vocabulary quizzes. What people care about is how much you hunt or how much you gather, right? That could be seen as a measure of intelligence. Research also shows that different IQ tests show different increases. For example, scores on the SAT have been decreasing in the United States over recent decades. So if people are truly becoming more intelligent, then you would see intelligence scores increase across the board, no matter what the measure was. But there are moderate gains that are seen across a variety of different measures of intelligence, but the highest increase has been shown by Raven's matrices as a measure of IQ. So Raven's matrices, this is one question from that test. So it was initially developed as a culture-free measure of IQ since it doesn't require specific cultural knowledge or language skills, and it relies on basic problem-solving skills. So you would see a pattern like this. So there's a box, then there's a diamond, and now there's a box with lines that are bolded inside. So what would be the next item in this sequence if you follow the logical rules given to you here? And the answer for this would be 2, because box, box, diamond, diamond. The way this box is different from this one is that it has bold lines inside, and the difference between this diamond and this one is that this one has bold lines inside. So some research suggests that the fact that this measure of IQ shows the highest increase over time indicates that the measure is not culture-free. So let's keep moving around. So people in many cultures are becoming more intelligent. We do see that. So one argument is that we have improved access to foods and calories. So improved nutrition is the reason for increasing IQ scores, because IQ could be a proxy for health and nutrition. However, this argument isn't strongly supported because increased nutrition does not closely parallel IQ scores at every place in the planet. Another reason for why maybe cultures are becoming more intelligent is that there's increased complexity in the world. you need a higher education in order to get a job. In 1890, 27% of men in the US had more than an 8th grade education compared to 96% of men and women in 2017. An increased percentage of the population has a bachelor's degree, especially among women. And there's also increased complexity in pop culture. There are more complicated plots in movies, shows, video games, like even just I'm kind of a hip hop head, so the Drake versus the Kendrick Lamar drama, or the Nicki Minaj versus Megan Thee Stallion drama, like that's so complex, and you have to watch all these TikToks to figure out what's happening. In the 1950s, in a show called Dragnet, there was one single storyline, whereas in other shows like Game of Thrones, they have over 250 cast members and multiple storylines that people are easily caught up with. So here you see the percentage of people that are getting a higher education, a bachelor's degree. And on the x-axis, we have the number of years. The different bars are representing different genders. So people who identify as male versus people who identify as female. And as you can see across the board, irrespective of whether you're male or female, as the years have increased, the percentage of people getting a bachelor's degree has increased vastly. And if we just look at the time point of 2010, it looks like about 36% of women are getting a bachelor's degree, whereas about 28% of men or males are getting a bachelor's degree. And this is a huge contrast to the 1940s, where less than 5% of women or females got a bachelor's degree, and about 7 or 8% of men would get a bachelor's degree. So which of these trends do you think will continue? Maybe you can write about that in your journal if you haven't written anything yet. So despite some cultural changes, other cultural habits persist across generations. This persistence is due to previous structures, influence of early conditions, and pluralistic ignorance. So let's talk about these. So this is a graph depicting the effects of some types of pre-existing structures. One important example is how modern economic development in sub-African countries resulted from the constraints put on them by the slave trade. The slave trade led to massive reduction in population size and the fostering of distrust due to the kidnapping of Africans to be sold into slavery by European colonists and the local populace. So these ideas have served to greatly hamper these countries' abilities to engage in effective economic development. So on the x-axis, we have the years from 1950 to 2000. On the y-axis, we have the average real per capita GDP, or how much earning those countries are able to make. And we have different countries separated by whether they export slaves or not, exported slaves during the slave trade or not. So for high slave export countries, you can see that across time, they're really struggling with per capita GDP, whereas those countries that had low number of slave exports have a steady increase in per capita GDP. So in the countries that engaged in higher levels of slave export have over time lower GDP, a common measure of economic development. Some researchers have argued that these findings suggest lingering after effects of the slave trade. So I was actually pointing at my other slide, so I'll point to it here. Oh no, actually it does follow it. Great, cool. Which is wild to think about. What about early conditions? So the early conditions in which a culture developed has long-standing influences on a culture. So the idea here is that cultural change departs from, but is also based on some initial cultural state. Some initial cultural states will limit the manner in which future cultural variation takes place. So for instance, in Boston, we have the Puritans, and in Quakers, and in Philadelphia, we have the Quakers. So in Boston, even currently, it exhibits more respect for authority. The main university there is Harvard, and it highlights public service, which reflects the Puritan beliefs, or the beliefs of the people who settled in that culture. In comparison, Philadelphia reflects more of the Quaker beliefs. So the Quakers emphasize more pragmatic concerns, or more real-life concerns, individual equality, and tolerance. The University of Pennsylvania reflects these cities' origins. The University of Pennsylvania offers schooling in medical, business, and engineering programs. So these are more pragmatic, right? More ready to address real life problems. And the University of Pennsylvania places little emphasis on public service. And it also received minimal support from Quakers because they didn't trust higher ed. So even early conditions can influence the current state of affairs, as shown in these examples in Boston and Philadelphia. Oh, this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. Pluralistic ignorance. This is another reason why cultural habits may persist. So people try to infer other people's thoughts from their behaviors. And this is a reasonable thing to do because sometimes you can accurately figure out people's thoughts by paying attention to what they say or do. But sometimes it's not the case, and it's hard to determine when your perceptions are accurate or not. Some thoughts are more likely to be stated publicly than other thoughts because of social norms, for instance. So people might misrepresent what other people actually think. Okay, so whenever everyone incorrectly assumes that everyone else is in favor of some cultural norm, they comply with the norm, perpetuating the culture, even though they themselves individually probably disagree with the norm. So one survey found that most students at Princeton University believed that other people at their school approved of heavy drinking at campus events, which led to the perpetuation of heavy drinking at campus events, even though individually each person did not approve of it, of this drinking. So when everyone incorrectly assumes everyone else is in favor of some cultural norm, they comply with the norm. So prohibition is another example. It seemed to have lasted as long as it did because of pluralistic ignorance. More people outwardly claimed that they were against alcohol sales, but privately people were making their own moonshine. All right. Oh, this is an interesting one. Oh, I wish we would have been in class to talk about this, but you can talk about this in your journal too. Cultural persistence, or the extent to which cultural beliefs stagnate or continue throughout generations, is more likely to occur in stable climates than in variable climates. So there's evidence across regions of the world and within countries. So for example, among the Navajo and Cree, those people or those tribes lived in more stable climates. And because of that, they're more likely to speak their native language. So how do you think climate change will affect this? As climate change continues its march and becomes worse, I think that culture might, the cultures that we have now might change. And I think we might have more of a global culture depending on where we are. If we're in a place that is flooded, probably in Oregon, Florida, places like that, versus a place that is more dry, those environmental conditions might change the way that culture is shaped, the kind of cultural norms we have, and the kind of previous structures that influence our current culture. All right, so that's the end of cultural evolution. So cultural ideas can be spread in a variety of ways. We talked about evoked, transmitted culture, all these other different kinds of cultural mechanisms for changing and transmitting information. But only certain cultural ideas will be passed down successfully within a population. Cultures have become increasingly interconnected, individualistic, and intelligent. And while some cultures change, some cultural ideas persist, and we talked about the reasons for that. All right, so that's all the information you need to know for the exam. I am going to post this up shortly, and I will see you next Tuesday. All right, bye.